Going to be 15.1, the beginning of the Cold War. And let's start with a quote from Winston Churchill, given here in Missouri, that really set the stage for the Cold War, drawing the line between West and East, freedom and subjugation, communism and capitalism. He said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lies all the capitals of ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another not only to the Soviet influence, but to a very high and in many cases increasing measure of control from Moscow." So this is a picture of him actually giving that speech here in Missouri at Fulton. He was invited by President Truman. So, our objectives: we are going to trace the reasons that the wartime alliance between the U.S. and the Soviets unraveled. We're going to explain how President Truman responded to Soviet aggression in Eastern Europe. And we're going to describe the causes and the results of Stalin's blockade of Berlin. So, let's look at how the Cold War began. Almost as soon as World War II was over, we were much more focused on Russia versus the United States than Germany versus the United States. We had two very different views on things like free speech, freedom of religion, how to govern the economy, but it was not just economic. This is important to realize, is that in general, when people think of communism and capitalism, we think, oh, we're talking about terms in economics. We're not. Especially at this time, it was moral. It was, we are right, they are wrong. Capitalism good, communism evil. It was much more basic and emotional than just like, well, we don't agree with their, version of economics. It was much more emotional than that. Now, at the Yalta Conference near the end of the war, Stalin had promised to allow free elections, but he was not telling the truth. And as soon as the war was over, most of the states that were the countries that surrounded the USSR, places like Poland, had elections in big air quotes that ended up with the communists in charge. And so most of these guys became what are called satellite states, Soviet controlled puppets. So here are some of the Soviet satellites: Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. These are known as the satellite states. Now, after the war, this led to a Cold War between the U.S. and USSR, this sort of mutual anger and distrust. And a Cold War is where nobody is fighting, although we got very close sometimes. There's no fighting between the two countries, but we're competing for influence and power around the world. Although we did quite often fight other communist countries instead of fighting the USSR. This is called a proxy war. When we go to war with Korea, that's not the same as going to war with the USSR in our minds, and so we are allowed to do that without starting World War III. So, looking at the Soviet challenge, countries like the US and Britain were very worried about the Iron Curtain falling over Eastern Europe, that term from Churchill's metaphor that we saw at the beginning. We were worried that communism was spreading like a disease. And President Truman, had to decide what's the best way to respond to this, especially because countries like Greece were very close to becoming communist, Turkey too. Truman decided on what was called, he gave this in a speech, he called it the Truman Doctrine. And this was in regards to Greece and Turkey being very close to falling to communism. He gave a speech where he said, we are going to stand with these free countries against communist aggression. We will stand with them financially. If necessary, we will stand with them militarily. And he called for $4 million to assist Greece and Turkey at that moment. Now, we also tried to stop communism by other methods as well. So the Truman Doctrine is beating communism back with a stick. The diplomat George Kennan was one of the guys who helped to create this policy of containment and the Truman Doctrine by basically saying we should not let communism spread any further, and we should back that up by force if we need to. Kennan, who was a diplomat to Russia for most of his life, believed that the Soviet Union was not like other countries. It would keep expanding. There was no stopping them unless there was force involved. And he called for the American government to stand up to Stalin. And so here's part of his telegram, sometimes called the long telegram for reasons that you might get looking at it. But much depends on health and vigor in our own society. World communism is like a malignant parasite which feeds only on diseased tissue. This is a point at which the domestic and foreign policies meet. Every courageous and incisive measure to solve internal problems of our own society, to improve self confidence, discipline, morale, and community spirit of our own people is a diplomatic victory over Moscow worth 1,000 diplomatic notes and joint communiques. Basically saying if we want to beat Moscow, we're going to have to be our best America at the same time. Now, we also wanted to stop communism by showing that capitalism could do good at the same time. And so our Secretary of State, a guy by the name of George Marshall, realized that Europe needed a lot of help, not just because communism was coming, but because they were still rebuilding after being destroyed by World War II. And so the Marshall Plan gave billions of dollars to European countries to help them rebuild. Now, this mainly took place in Western Europe, and we only gave this money to non-communist countries. And so this helped save millions of lives, and it also was our kind of like a goodwill gesture, more than just like, using our money to build up arms. We're also using our money to help save lives. So here's George Marshall, 1880 to 1959, from Pennsylvania. He was a soldier, the chief of staff during World War II from the Army. He was Secretary of State, later went on to Secretary of Defense, and got the Nobel Peace Prize for the Marshall Plan in 1953. Not bad. So, which brings us to the big question we still argue. What is the best way to stop aggression? How do we stop other countries? Is it through guns, through money, or through aid? And as we see with the 1950s, we tried all three. Now, let's look at Soviet aggression during this time. Germany and its capital city of Berlin were both divided after World War II into communist and capitalist regions. These were really the front lines of the Cold War. Now, since Berlin was surrounded by Russian territory, that was a problem for the United States. Stalin basically shut off all the roads into the city of Berlin and hoped that he could starve them out, starve out the capitalist countries, and make all of Berlin a or a communist city in East Berlin. So instead of the U.S. and other countries just giving up, though, and not wanting to go to war with Russia, we did something very clever, which is we dropped food and aid into West Berlin from airplanes. This is called the Berlin Airlift. So here's East Germany and West Germany. West Germany is capitalist, East Germany communist. But you can also see that Berlin, the capital, is there in East Germany, and West Berlin is capitalist and East Berlin is communist. This leads to a problem during the airlift. And so here is one of the planes from the Berlin Airlift dropping supplies, and a bunch of school children are there because occasionally they also dropped candy. Now, the Berlin Airlift showed what countries are going to have to do. We're going to have to work together. We're going to have to think non-laterally. We're going to have to be clever to defeat the Soviet aggression. And to make it official, Western countries decided that we're going to make an official kind of club, a group of countries called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that said all of these countries are going to agree that if the Soviet Union attacks one of these countries, you're attacking all of these countries, which is both a good way to defend a country and a good way to start World War III. The Soviets had their own version called the Warsaw Pact, which was basically NATO except for communists. And so here is NATO and the Warsaw Pact countries in Europe by 1983.